Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the Mental Healthy Podcast. We're glad to have you with us here today. I've got a great guest today, a friend of mine I've known for about 8 years, and I'll let her introduce herself, though.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Knapp, for asking me to join you. Yes, I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. Knapp now for 8 years, been at Liberty University. I'm currently the chair of the social work department there. And so that relates to my dissertation topic, which just recently finished my doctorate. And that gave me an opportunity to present on a topic that is real important to me. It actually relates to my clinical practice. I have some clinical practice for about 20 years, and so you'll probably get a chance to hear a little bit about that later today, but really delighted to be here.
Well, great. And I'm so happy I get to call you Dr. Nitz now.
Yes, thank you.
Well, you've been working on it for all these years and slaving away on all that, and
Yes,
so it's nice to have that done and
Yes,
behind you. So
definitely.
yeah. Well, I know about a few months back you did a great presentation at our mental health summit, that's part of what I think we're going to talk about today. And it's a long title, and I don't want to say it wrong. So could you maybe share with the listeners what it is?
Sure. The title was Beauty from Ashes, Empowering Future Behavioral Health Professionals to Transform Their Past Traumas into Assets.
Okay. And is that the same thing as your dissertation or in the ballpark?
Yes, the
Okay.
dissertation has a little drier title, but yes,
Oh, yeah.
that's the same. It's the same topic.
It wouldn't be academia if it wasn't a little bit dry. So,
That's right.
well, that's cool. Well, tell us about it. I mean, I heard you say traumas, turning them into assets and all that. What was your dissertation about? And what interested you in this whole topic?
Well, when we begin research, we always talk about building on current body of knowledge and then trying to extend that. So, first, when I think about trauma and I think about behavioral health professionals who have experienced trauma in the past, which is the topic, what do we already know? And what we already know about our early trauma is that childhood trauma has lifelong impact. Most of the listeners of your podcast probably know about the Kaiser Permanente study back in the 90s that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, can have lifelong implications for people. And when we say ACEs, we're referring to early child abuse, child neglect, growing up in a household where there was substance use or incarceration, even divorce or significant discord in a family can be so traumatic and challenging for a child that they can have implications that last for decades. And this can be physical health, emotional health. They're prone to depression, anxiety, and negative behaviors. And then the second thing that we know from previous research is that there is a disproportionate amount of mental health professionals who have experienced these ACEs themselves. And there's some studies that say as high as 70% of people who choose people helping as a profession have experienced this kind of childhood trauma. In my own study of 347 social work students, 80% had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 40% had experienced 4 out of the 10 experiences that they were assessing. And, I often say if we got a group of people helpers in the room, a whole room full of people helpers, and we went around and we had time to tell each other our stories, we would all have a story.
Mm-hmm.
And that we really see over and over that God uses often suffering and difficult experiences that we've either experienced ourselves or maybe somebody that we deeply cared about to soften our hearts and to move us to want to move outward and be part of the solution. So we often find that when you're talking about psychologists, social workers, counselors, nurses, teachers, people who choose people helping as a profession often have these kinds of histories. And that's really important for us to know because it can have a negative impact, obviously, not only on them, as we saw in the past research, and their well-being, but also can have an impact on the people that they serve because they're at higher risk for compassion fatigue. They may be struggling themselves with depression, anxiety. We have issues of countertransference that might interfere with our objectivity and how we see clients and our ability to really be what they need us to be at that time. So I wanted to look into this further, and I was specifically interested in the role of relationships and specifically attachment relationships, in part because of my clinical practice, and we'll talk a little more about that.
Okay. Well, that's neat. I mean, your research sort of confirmed this stereotype that people in these fields do come from, generally speaking, some difficult backgrounds, and
Absolutely.
that's it's good that you confirm that. And you use that big word, attachment theory, that a lot of people in the field have heard about or
Yes.
familiar with. I know you have a special interest in attachment theory. How does that connect to this whole topic of trauma and childhood experiences and all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Like you said, it becomes a big topic. Once you understand attachment, you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And I like to say, the good news is, and I would say to anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you've had a history like this, there is hope. We serve a God of redemption. There is an avenue for healing, and certainly ultimately through our relationship with him, but he also provides human relationships, flesh and blood, which often are really critical and are an important context for healing. And this builds on attachment theory, where we've learned that those relationships are key. Most people are familiar with John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, Mary Main, who've done research in the area of attachment. And what they discovered, initially in working with children, was how critical to our well-being relationships are, and for children with their primary caregiver, mother, father, whoever's providing that primary care, that when that relationship is predictable and nurturing and consistent, that's really key to that child's development. And they talked about kind of two aspects of that relationship. One, we call a safe haven, that when the child learned there was somebody they could depend on that would care for them and be consistent and nurture them, that serves as a safe haven for that child. And that when they have that consistency, that becomes what we call a secure base, that becomes actually a base from which the child can explore. They have so much confidence coming from that relationship that they can go out and deal with challenges, explore their world, become independent, because they know that they can return back to that secure base. And then to further the research, we've discovered that attachment that was so key in childhood actually persists. Our desire for that persists through lifetime, and that our adult attachments also are really key, and that every one of us wants a secure attachment in our lives. We seek to be known. We seek to be understood.
Yep.
So even in adulthood, we want, I always say, who are your people? Who are your people? Everybody needs some people. Everybody needs a person that they feel is their safe haven, somebody who sees me, they know me. Tim Keller talks about how we desire to be known and loved, and that we need to know that we matter to somebody, that they have our back, that we're there for them, and then they become our secure base, that with that confidence and that support from that relationship, we're able to take on the challenges of the world, sometimes deal with some very stressful, traumatic things when we have someone that we can kind of return to. Sometimes they hold up the mirror to us and challenge us and help us see ways we need to grow, but that those relationships are really key to our well-being. And what's really good news is that the subsequent attachment researchers have discovered that the ability to have that kind of relationship, even if you did not have that relationship as a child, even if you did not have a secure relationship the way I just described, that you can achieve what we call earned secure, that you can learn to have healthy, secure relationships with a significant other. And this could be a romantic partner, a spouse, it could be a parent, it could be a sister, close friend, but the important thing is that we have somebody in our life that we can sense that security. And then in adulthood, of course, that becomes a reciprocal relationship. We learn to give that nurture, we learn to be that secure base, that safe haven for someone else. And research that we've seen, particularly with the military population, but also with adult children of alcoholics, people who've survived sexual abuse, there's increasing research that those primary relationships, primary adult relationships, actually can be a context for healing from the trauma itself. And that's what kind of tied into some of my clinical practice in observing that when people who've experienced trauma, if they have someone in their lives that they can even process some of those traumatic experiences on, that can be really, really powerful.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've heard some people describe it like this: you either learn to trust or not trust, based on your life experience. But then if you don't trust, you don't have relationships. And if you don't have relationships, it's like being in solitary confinement.
Right.
And then your life stinks.
Yes. Yeah.
And so,
Yes. And your resilience goes, your ability to deal with stressors, your ability
yeah.
to deal with difficulty. And you're exactly right. That's what the research shows.
Oh, it makes so much sense. I mean, but I like the part. I mean, some people hear all this and they just think, oh, you trust or you don't trust.
Right.
But you said a phrase, earned secure.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? How do you go from not trusting to suddenly you trust and then your life is happy or something like that?
Right. That's a great question. There's a lot of some interventions, some forms of therapy actually aim to assist with just that, to help people learn how to trust. And so what that means is someone who maybe has not experienced that in childhood, and they may be prone to what we call anxious attachment, where maybe they desire a relationship, they want that relationship in an adult relationship, but they're fearful of being rejected, they're fearful of being abandoned, and that can cause, as you can imagine, all kinds of problematic behaviors. We become too clingy, or we become too anxious in those relationships when we're fearful that we're going to lose them. Or another coping mechanism that children adopt if they've had challenging relationships early on is to be more avoidant. We kind of close ourselves off and we protect our heart and we don't share as openly. So the idea of earned secure is that we can learn to be vulnerable and dare to trust someone in a relationship, to develop a positive and secure relationship. And that takes time, it takes intentionality. It means certainly finding a person that is trustworthy to begin to be vulnerable. And frankly, it's often in the experience that happens in tiny little baby steps of learning to be a little bit vulnerable and allowing the other person to care for you, learning to care for the other person in little ways and let them receive it, where you begin to learn to express your needs, you get to hear their needs, you learn to relinquish control, not be so controlling, by the fear that we can have in relationships, have them accept choices. We can accommodate their needs, and that in those baby steps we learn to be vulnerable, and that it works out for us, that we have someone that's in our corner that can be that secure base. And of course, like I said, many people, if you've had really traumatic experiences, professional intervention may be a terrific option for you to learn to truly have that kind of secure relationship with another person.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the program here is the hallmark of our program here at Liberty in all our different departments is the integrationist approach. And when I think about this topic of attachment and earned secure attachment and overcoming past hurts and all that, it reminds me of a verse that one of my counselors gave my wife and I when we were in our premarital counseling. It's 1 John 4:18, which says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love." And so love makes us perfect, per se, or perfect in our ability to relate to others. Because if you trust because we're loved, then we can be in relationship and life is happy.
Yes.
And of course, but if we have not been loved in our lives, we're not going to trust, and then we're going to be lonely. And like I said earlier, our life stinks. But we as Christians can have a relationship with God where we experience perfect love. And then we learn through that relationship
Absolutely.
to trust. Yeah, we're academic here, folks, but we're bringing the word too.
Yeah, well, and exactly what you described, that positive cycle, that as we learn to trust, we make ourselves vulnerable, which actually then deepens the trust, and the relationships keep deeper and deeper. And this happens in human relationships. Of course, we let each other down.
Yeah.
We have to learn how to ask forgiveness. We have to learn to forgive and release. But like you said, ultimately, that's our relationship with God, is learning more and more to trust and to surrender ourselves to Him. Because as we learn to be vulnerable and surrender to Him and learn to trust Him, our relationship deepens, and that becomes a positive cycle over and over. And one of the things that I remember learning about attachment, and we were talking about child attachment, child caregiver attachment, but was that children need to learn both to let their parents love in and to also let them be in charge. And sometimes when I was working with families where children had fractured attachments or were struggling with their attachment, I'd say, "How's your kid doing?" and letting your love in and letting you be in charge. And I remember at one point hearing, I don't know if it was a sermon or Bible study, somebody's talking about that our relationship with God, that ultimately our relationship with God requires that kind of trust, that we would dare to believe that he deeply loves us. I'm going to get choked up, but that he deeply loves us. He delights in us. There's a verse in Zechariah that talks about him delighting in us. And the idea that the God of the universe delights and sees me, knows me, understands me better than myself, and still loves me. But that also means surrendering, letting him be in charge, and trusting that his love is so deep that I can let him be, even when really horrible things happen in my life, or even when I put through real challenges, that ultimately I trust his love and his care and his power and his ability to affect a good outcome. So yeah, it's a really beautiful thing that God mirrors all that process, I think, in the relationship between children and their parents, and then invites us into a relationship in adulthood where we learn this kind of sacrificial love. And of course, his son demonstrated that sometimes we sacrifice our needs for others, right? And that ultimately we experience the love of God himself. So
That's awesome. Well, we're talking about your dissertation and all. Let me ask you, what did you hope to discover in your research? Like when you got started with all this, I know we always end up with something different than what we expected,
Yeah.
but what did you hope to discover?
yeah. Well, first, you want to see if the past research kind of holds up your current research, your population. I was specifically looking at social work students because we were seeing a lot of people who were pursuing social work as a degree who had this kind of early trauma. So I wanted to see, does this seem to be consistent, what we've found in past research? And then I was also interested in, as I just said, what role might relationships have in helping to heal or moderating the effect of those ACEs. We knew that from the research that ACEs predisposes people to high levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. So I wanted to see if students that had secure relationships, if that kind of buffered that response or reduced that response. And then the other thing that I wanted to add an additional element to it, in addition to the relationships themselves, was I wanted to look at emotional intimacy and say, would the power of those secure relationships in moderating the effects of early childhood trauma, could be enhanced if there was deeper emotional intimacy and sharing between the parties?
Good questions.
Yeah, and
I like where you're going.
yeah, I can tell you what we found. So,
Yeah, please.
not a surprise, consistent with the research in the sample, we did find that ACEs, that childhood trauma, did correlate highly with depression, anxiety, and stress. Currently, now, today, as adults, decades later, people were still struggling with some of these things, and we're at higher risk for that. And then we found that, secure relationships had an inverse relationship with DAS, which again is not a big surprise. So when people had very positive, strong relationships, there was less depression, anxiety, and stress. And you can debate a little bit what's cause and effect here, but it's important to note, again, there may be a cyclical dynamic going on there.
Yeah.
What was particularly interesting to me was kind of delving into more of a newer area that had not been researched as thoroughly with emotional intimacy and the attachment, was that when we combined having a strong relationship and high emotional intimacy, that was protective. There was an interaction effect. And what I mean by emotional intimacy was measured by your ability to be transparent. So the participants would identify their primary attachment relationship. Many of them identified a spouse or a romantic partner, but some had a parent or a sibling or friend. And that primary person that they rely on, that primary attachment relationship, they kind of did an assessment in terms of how they felt, in terms of that sense of security, kind of relating back to some of those attachment measures that I told you about. But they also reported measures of emotional intimacy. To what degree do they feel comfortable sharing their true selves, sharing, all the flaws, all the warts, right? All the, can I share with my spouse on a hard day or my grumpy day, or can I share my ugly thoughts as well as my thoughts that I'm proud of? I wanted to see it that did in fact have a moderating effect on ACEs and DAS. So this led to the hope and the plan that if we could help people enhance their primary attachment relationship, both in its sense of security, but also in emotional intimacy, having people sharing deeply and learning how to do that, and maybe by extension even sharing about that past trauma, that there would be a positive outcome. And if you don't mind, I'll share a story with you that kind of brings us to mind. One of the things that we do as we prepare social workers to practice, we talk a lot about self-awareness, self-correction, understanding what's going on for me, what are my biases, but even what are some of my history, how might that be impacting the lens by which I look at life. And I remember this one student that had shared with us at one point about some really significant trauma she had experienced as a child, and it really appeared very unresolved, really was struggling even to share some of it even very broadly with us, and became apparent she had never sought treatment or anything like that. She was functioning as a mom and student and wife, but was really struggling, and we encouraged her to consider maybe getting some treatment, not only for her own sake, as we're talking about, because she's more subject to some of these mental health outcomes that would be negative, but also, frankly, for the sake of her future clients.
Yeah.
She initially was very defensive, felt like this, frankly, was none of our business. We ended that interaction with her, and a week later, she came back. And again, I'm going to get choked up on you, but tears streaming down her face.
Sure.
She one time that she said, "Thank you so much. Thank you so much for holding up this mirror and helping me see that I needed to go get help, and then I needed to share this with somebody." And it turns out, she said, I had never even told my husband some of these things. Now, interestingly enough, part of her brain wanted help, right? She shared this with us, something she hadn't even shared, this trauma with her own husband. But as a result of that interaction, she went and talked with her husband, and to her delight, he received her, with open arms and lots of support and sadness for her that she had experienced this. But there was so much healing that even happened in that 1 week just by sharing this with her husband and deepening, I would say, their relationship. She said, I got an appointment on Tuesday. And was on the track towards healing, getting some professional assistance and support from her husband. And we're really hopeful. I think she's continued in the program. I think she's going to be a phenomenal asset to her clients in the future, and being able to extend that sense of hope and healing that she's experiencing even herself. So.
That's awesome. That's so encouraging as a professor to see your students, work through that and then be stronger because of it. It's funny. It reminds me. In the past, I've worked with different addictions and stuff, and in the 12-step movement, they have this phrase: "You're only as sick as your secrets."
Yes.
Have you heard that before?
So true. So true.
And it's just like what you're saying. If people hold secrets about some abuse or adverse childhood experience or whatever, you keep it secret because you feel bad about it.
Yeah.
And or people are going to think this or that about me if they know this or whatever. And if they can be transparent about it, they break through the secrecy, and that fear of, if something bad is going to happen, if someone knows, that gets corrected as being false. Yeah. And then the shame or guilt we have about it dissipates. Yeah. And that's a lot of therapy right there in a nutshell, listeners.
That's right. That's right.
But that's so cool. You got to see that with one of your own students. I'm sure you see it with more than one.
Yeah. But that's the story I like to tell sometimes, because it was hard for her to hear, and it's exactly what you just said. It's that shame that she had been carrying for decades, and so fearful of anybody knowing, and particularly, and people that were close to her knowing, because it goes back to attachment. She was fearful of being rejected or abandoned or being seen to be too broken, and it was in that sharing, like you said, dispelling those secrets. And of course, she chose someone who was trustworthy, her husband, that she could share that with. But him loving her through that and showing her that he was still going to be her secure base, he was still going to be her safe haven, was hugely impactful. And that's another passion of mine that comes from my clinical practice. I touched on that a little bit, but I worked my clinical practice for over 20 years with usually children and adolescents who had experienced some significant trauma, but also adults that had trauma. And what I really found was that it could be very effective to talk through some of these issues with me as a trained clinician, of course. But when we invited, with certainly their permission, but when we invited a spouse into the room, when we invited a trusted sibling or whatever, to have the person be able to process some of this trauma with their family member who was going to go home with them, right? They're going to leave me in the office, but when they're going to go home with them it really powerfully influenced the way that I did my practice, and realized I think it's really an untapped resource.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about theory and all these different attachment styles and all this, but that story you shared of that student a second ago, and you're starting to get to the nitty gritty
Yeah.
of how all this plays out.
Yeah.
So, talk to me a little more about, what are some of the practical implications of this? How do you take all this theory and use it?
Sure.
And how does it inform your practice? You said you've been practicing for a number of years. Like, how does this all play in?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is education always, right? Educating students and even professionals. I think even a professional context to have in service for people to be aware, certainly in clinical supervision, often clinical supervisors are aware of this dynamic that some past trauma might have some implications in terms of countertransference and things like that. But just continuing that education of have people understand without that shame that you talked about, and to normalize it, that this is really normal. That in fact, the majority of helping professionals have their own stories, and so to begin to be willing to share that and maybe seek some support is important. We particularly have looked in the social work department, honestly, even as a result of my study. I've had some meetings as recently as this week talking about how can we get this more into our curriculum to prepare our students and have them be aware of how ACEs can impact them, how it impacts their clients, but also how it impacts them, makes them more prone to depression, anxiety, burnout, and for them to cultivate habits of self-awareness, self-correction, and we've put in even some assignments as an educator. If I'm talking to any educators, we've put in some assignments where people look at case studies and have an opportunity to kind of reflect on how that practitioner, that social worker's experience might impact the way that they serve that client, and also then to do that application to themselves. So the idea of ACEs and its impact, but also the importance of those primary attachments, and have them do a little self-assessment, have them identify, as we go through process of people applying to our program, we have them do a lot of self-reflection in terms of what are my strengths and areas for growth professionally, but I'd also like them to start thinking about who's my person, who's my primary relationship, and sometimes we've talked in the past about, who's your support group and who's your support system, and I think that's a good question, who are you going to call if you have a flat tire or something like that, but, taking it a step further and saying, who's your primary attachment, and is that healthy? Could that be strengthened? That's worthy of intention and opportunity to try to strengthen that. And then the next part of it is those emotional intimacy skills. And even in counseling, social work, our programs, we're teaching these skills that benefit people in their personal lives too. I often say that's one of the things I love about being a social worker, because we are the instrument. So as we learn those skills to be a good social worker, it actually helps us in our personal lives, and as we grow in our personal lives, helps us to be a better professional. But we can be teaching skills about how do you do good active listening, how do you share, what's good communication, so that you can have that opportunity to deepen that relationship, even with that person that you consider your primary attachment, and that's actually protective. That's not just, oh, that's my home life versus my professional life. That's not just, oh, that's nice to go home to this really warm, safe relationship, but that actually, is good for your emotional well-being, is good for you, for your physical well-being, and it's good for your clients to be investing in those relationships, and that you can deepen that by learning those skills of emotional intimacy. Again, not to diminish the importance sometimes of professional intervention, sometimes when we get stuck, but to really intentionally invest in those relationships. And the other thing that I would hope from a clinical research standpoint, and this is, are we availing ourselves of those opportunities in the counseling room, in the treatment room? And we can accomplish a lot one-on-one, me with you as the clinician, but are we looking for those opportunities to invite those family members in particularly? And I just would say that was something I learned from my clinical practice was, it was one thing for someone to feel empathy for me. It was one thing for me to help challenge some of their distorted thinking. But when they were sitting in a room and sharing of themselves and sharing about their trauma, to see from somebody who they trust, to see that compassion on their face, to see the sadness in their eyes, to hear and connect and really understand the trauma that person had been through, to see the indignance on their face of the injustice that they had encountered was just transformational.
Yeah.
And that gave a context to which that person was much more open to challenging sometimes their own internalized messages that were inaccurate. They'd come to believe they were not worthwhile, that they were, damaged goods. You talked about shame,
Yeah.
that other people aren't trustworthy, the world's unpredictable, but that in the context of those relationships, we can start to believe that I am worthwhile, I'm valuable, I'm seen. Other people I can let them in, and I can enjoy a healthy reciprocal relationship, and the world's actually a really pretty great place to live. So.
I tell you, a few things you said sort of stirred a lot of thoughts in my own head, and I'm thinking of how listeners can apply this as well. When you talked about how you try to help students become more self-aware and then self-corrective,
Yeah.
that reminds me, I mean, you and I have both practiced for a few years,
Yep.
and I used to work with some children in a number of different settings, but I remember one time when I was a school counselor for a while, I was dealing with this child who was feeling a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment, and when I asked them about what, they said that, well, their parents were divorced, and I said, okay, well, and what about your parents being divorced makes you feel this way? And they said, well, it's my fault.
Yeah.
And I said, really? And so we explored it, and there's a lot of research to back this up. A lot of kids, when parents get divorced, the kids will blame themselves if they don't know how to make sense of it.
Yes.
Because kids are naturally neurotic, meaning they blame themselves. And so I did exactly what you just said. I talked to the parents about it, and I said, well, could we bring you in and
Yeah.
talk with the child about why you got divorced
Yeah.
and what that had to do with the child or not?
Yeah.
And they said, yeah. And so they came in there and just playing out what you said. And they said, Mom and Daddy got divorced because this and this happened and we didn't get along. And you kids were there, but you had nothing to do with it. It was just because Mom and Daddy had fights and stuff. And they sat there and explained it to the kid, and the kid went, what?
Yeah.
like I thought I did something stupid or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you just sort of see the weight come off this child, like they didn't feel like it was their fault anymore.
Yeah.
And then the child, everything you said, they started to improve in their depression and anxiety. All that weight of me thinking I ruined my parents' marriage wasn't true.
Yeah.
So you correct their false attributions,
Absolutely.
their misunderstandings of things that happened. So is that in the ballpark of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, again, it's meaningful for me as a clinician to tell. It was meaningful, I'm sure, for you to try to explain to this boy.
Yeah.
But to hear that from his mom, to hear that from
Yes.
his dad, to look right in his eyes and say, sweetheart, this was not your fault. This is me and Daddy, or this is me and Mommy.
Yeah.
And the way that how deeply he's going to internalize that. And I saw that a lot with children. You talked earlier about shame. Children that have experienced abuse, they often they internalize that very similar sense. This is something. There's something terribly wrong with me. I'm not lovable, and people can carry that into adulthood. That there's this underlying fear that I'm not truly lovable, and so somebody's going to reject me or abandon me. And to have that person who loves them say, this was not your fault. What happened to you was not your fault, and these are the things that I love about you. These are the qualities that I see in you. And for a child that was abandoned by a parent, that fear that they're always going to be abandoned, but they may have internalized that sense. And so and I worked with a lot of adoptive families, for an adoptive mom to, articulate what happened and what resulted in that child needing to be separate from the biological parent, and to reassure them and have them say, I thought that I was a bad baby. I thought that I was, too hard. I thought that, and for the parent to be able to reassure that child and to reassure them of how they're never going to leave them, they're never going to abandon them. They're always going to be the parent. They're always going to be your mom or always going to be your dad. And to validate that, say it makes sense why you're afraid that people are going to leave you. It makes sense why you're afraid to let my love in. It makes sense that you start to think that everybody is going to leave. And It's one of my favorites is watching. Often it's the dads when I was working with kids that would get so indignant and about the abuse that their children had suffered under the hands of other people.
Yeah.
And I'm like, let your child see that. That is so validating and empowering to your child for
Yeah.
a dad to say, that was wrong.
Yeah.
What they did to you was wrong. You were a little girl or you were a
Yeah.
little boy.
Yeah.
And that was wrong that grown-up used you like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes they go so far as say, if I could see him right now, and say, if I could see him right now, what would I? And I'd prompt them, if you could see him right now, what would you tell them, Dad? What would you tell that person that abused your child? And you just see the child just light up to hear Daddy come to their defense. And again, that took it from the head to the heart.
Yep.
And then for that dad and that mom to go home with that child and understand this is why my child's being so challenging at home sometimes. This is what my child needs to be reassured of my love and that I can love them through the hard things. And so that's if I ever get preaching, that's what I get preaching on is
good.
invite those family members in because that's what we want. That's what we want. We want families to be able to be whole. We want people to be ultimately able to access what I think God desires in those relationships is to have that safety, have that security, and from that be able to learn to deal with the challenges of the world, learn to serve others, learn to be influence and a blessing to other people.
Yeah. You know what you're making me think of is I've read some research about this and I've seen it in some of the clients I've worked with, say a lady who's into prostitution or things like that, or being a stripper or things like that, that they have a much higher rate of sexual abuse when they're children, and they end up going into prostitution and things like that. And what I read in the research is that a lot of times people will sort of recreate similar situations later on in their lives to traumas they experienced earlier in their lives if they don't resolve it.
Right.
And so in the case of prostitutes, like I said, they have, higher rates of childhood sexual abuse if they don't get that corrective experience like you're talking about where them being abused or used in a certain way, they'll just recreate it again and again.
Absolutely. That's what they know. It's what they believe about themselves, that they are just to be used, that they're not worthy of love or in the kind of way that we would know it.
Yeah. But then, of course, God can use you and me and all the students and professors listening, that we can go out there and help people have new understandings of themselves about how they should be treated.
Absolutely.
And how those adverse childhood experiences were wrong.
Yeah.
It's certainly not God's will for children to be abused or things like that.
Yeah. No.
So.
Yeah, and I think that, like you said, that in our human relationships, I think we get a glimpse of what God offers in our relationship with Him, and when we understand, like I said, I love the passage in Zechariah, but that God delights in us, that He looks at every one of us, and He knows the problems, He knows the errors, He knows the sin, He knows where we're broken, but just loves us deeply. Do you have time for another story? I'll tell
Absolutely.
you one more story.
Please,
I have a picture in my head that comes that
Yes.
sometimes I've shared with people.
Yeah.
This actually happened with my pastor. And it was at a time in my life when, I was kind of just starting to learn and really understand the depth of God's love for us. And I was kind of moving from what was a very intellectual understanding of God's love that, I kind of had this picture in my mind of, I love you all, kind of hovering over this stadium full of people. It was very impersonal.
Yeah.
I believed it, but it was
Yeah.
very impersonal. And I remember I was talking with my pastor about this issue, and he had a little girl, 5 years old, that was playing in the room near us in his, we were at his home, and we were talking about God's love for us. And he turned over, at one point she had one of these cute little ballerina skirts on, this little tutu or something like that. And she started spinning around. And so she put her arms out and she's spinning around and her little skirt is flying up. She said, "Look at me, Daddy, look at me, Daddy." And, the delight in his eyes, his just enjoyment. And this is the same little girl that probably had a temper tantrum earlier that day, right? But that delight in his eyes of just seeing her and enjoying being with her. And I got a glimpse of God's love for each one of us. And I thought, why would I ever think that God's love for us would be less than what a daddy would have for his little girl? And it's just... so, I mean, he is inviting us into that kind of relationship with him. And I think sometimes he shows us through flesh and blood what's even possible. We're certainly going to let each other down. I know in my own story, if I told you my own story, God used my husband to open my eyes to the possibility of somebody loving me in that way. But of course, he does it very imperfectly. Sorry, Jeff. But that God, gave me an understanding of what he offers even more deeply and more than that.
Yeah. Well, Jesus taught through parables.
Yes, he did.
So your stories are great.
Yeah.
That makes it more real. Yeah. But I tell you what, I want to respect your time and the time of the listeners. So, here at the end of the podcast, I always try to ask everyone sort of a catch-all question. Is there anything else God's put on your heart or mind today that you want to share with the listeners before we wrap it up?
Sure. I mean, certainly as educators, I hope this was helpful if anybody's an educator or a clinician to think about, how you're working with people you serve, to consider those primary relationships and how we can deepen those through sharing and emotional intimacy. But I think probably more than anything that I'd want to leave is knowing that the people that are listening, we've probably got a number of people listening right now that have had some of these difficult experiences in childhood, that there is hope, and that God offers hope to you through relationship with him and through relationship with others, and just invites you to be vulnerable and pursue that, and let him transform you in the process.
Amen. Amen to that. Well, everyone, I'm talking to Dr. Cheryl Nitz, Dr. Cheryl Nitz.
Thank you.
And you absolutely, and you earned it. And if you want to hear more about what she's saying today, you just finished a dissertation. And is that in Dissertation Abstracts International yet? I know it takes a little bit.
It might take a little while, but it'll get there. Yeah.
Okay. and you can look it up by your name.
Sure.
Cheryl with a CHERYL.
Yep.
Nitz, Nitz. Yep. And so they can look that up and learn more. But thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was a privilege.
Absolutely appreciate you being here. And listeners, we appreciate you being with us here as well. And we hope you join us next time here in the Mental Healthy Podcast. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.